And so this is being recorded now. Right, so yeah, let's make a start then. And I would like to thank you for being here, and also like to welcome you to the first actually continuing professional development seminar series offered by the International Federation of Social Workers. This is a 6-week series, and it was developed through collaboration between academics, mostly from countries that have either historically or currently experienced the impact of political conflict. And that includes colleagues from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Cyprus, Greece, Northern Ireland, Colombia, and other countries. Now, the majority of the presentations in this seminar series is based on primarily research and also the lived experience of political conflict. And our presenters will include academics, will include educators, also practitioners, frontline practitioners, and people with lived experience of war, political and armed conflict, and also in particular in the settings of health and social care. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and also wish to thank IFSW for their vision, their support, and but also for hosting these seminars. And now we'll pass on to my co-host, Reima Maglajlic.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see in the chat where people are from. So I'll just walk you through the structure of the seminars for today and for the forthcoming sessions. So focusing on social work during the political conflict, working with refugees and displaced populations, post-war reconstruction, peace building and reconciliation, lesser heard voices in the context of conflict, and concluding with the role of international organizations and global partnerships. The seminars will have the following structure. So the session today and the following ones are going to have 2 to 3 presenters, and each presenter will have about 10 to 15 minutes to present their work, following by a brief 5-minute opportunity to ask any immediate questions that you might have, and they might be similar. At the end of the overall session, we will have further opportunities for question and answer, and we will try and see, I think there was an initial question whether we can see each other. We will certainly aim to enable that towards the end if possible. We encourage all participants to attend all 6 sessions. Apart from the first one, there will be the rest of the sessions will take place on Tuesdays, 5:30 to 6:45 British Standard Time, concluding with the session on the 3rd of May. So we'll spend some time over the next 6 weeks together exploring this topic from a variety of contexts and points of view. For all the registered participants who attend all sessions, we'll be able to provide a certificate of registration at the end, which I know is important for some of you as part of your continuing professional development. During the seminar, please use the chat function or Q&A to summarize use the chat function to summarize your key learning from the session, and you can use also the Q&A button to ask questions. We will try to then share that via our social media. Please remain muted during the presentations and respect all of the presenters and participants, because we come from a variety of conflicts and variety of experiences, which can be quite visceral and hard to explore for some of us. To help us learn from the series and to develop a future seminar series, we will, of course, as social work academics frequently do, share a brief survey with you to see what worked well and what needs improving, and we'll be grateful if you can take a few minutes to do so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the first of our speakers, Rory Truell from IFSW.
Oh, thank you so much, Vasilios and Ria. And all the universities and all the people that have helped put this program together. It's really wonderful because it's so important to be understanding the role of social work in war and conflict situations and as peace builders. And so this is perhaps very timely for some people. And perhaps others would say it should have happened many years ago, but I'm so pleased to see that it's happening. And so all the university partners, all the participants, thank you so much from IFSW. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just talking about the the importance of the role of social work in war and conflict situations. And if I've got time, I've got a little stopwatch here. I'll try to give some examples from places of which the speakers, the other speakers, aren't from. So that's what I'll attempt to do. The modern social work profession at a global level, when it came together, it really came together at actually a time of war. After in the build-up and during and after the First World War, many professional associations of social work came together, and it was actually the formation of the global profession where they started to cooperate and communicate with each other. And there were millions of refugees from the First World War that social workers were responding to, supporting, helping them in their journeys to find safety, helping them to return to their home countries, and supporting children that had been separated from their families and so forth. But social workers also had a really strong social work perspective of how to build peace at that time, and worked extremely hard to advocate for peace in the world. But actually, since that time, since that early formation, of which actually when IFSW was formed in 1928, we had a gap and a period in our understanding in the global profession of what is the role of social work in war and conflict situations. And I think that the profession had been a little bit neglectful for many, many years. There wasn't a single policy or guideline to support social workers in war and conflict situations. There was in the 80s and 90s some development in this process by the formation of the IFSW Human Rights Commission, which really wanted to support social workers whose rights were being violated, particularly at that time under the dictatorships in Latin America. But in the last 10 years, things have picked up quite a lot. And I think they've picked up because the Federation as a whole has grown significantly in the last 10 years. We've got now voices from professional associations and social workers from throughout the world who have experienced in their generation war. They've gone through war. They've been social workers in war situations, and they've been social workers in post-war situations in terms of peace building, reconciliation processes, and so forth. And so now we're in a much better position to be able to look at what is the role of social workers in these awful contexts. And I just want to acknowledge all social workers that have been a practitioner in a war situation. It's an incredibly stressful part of being a social worker. Not only do they suffer along with their communities the terror of war. Will the bomb drop on my house today? Will my children be killed today? But they also play a role and have an added burden of responsibility of trying to support people as a professional social worker in that context. And sometimes that is incredibly demanding. In some situations, in civil wars or in inter-country wars, a social worker's perspective may be different from the authorities that are at war with each other. Sometimes the authorities that are at war with each other completely demonize the other side. And it becomes a culture, and a feature in many war zones. And social workers know from their experience of dealing with family conflict, community conflict, that demonizing the other doesn't actually help build peace. It doesn't help build an understanding with the people you're fighting against. It doesn't help build a vision for how everybody's rights need to be advanced at the end of that conflict period. So, social workers have an extremely demanding personal trauma and added set of responsibilities. I want to just talk quickly now about some of the examples of what social workers do. I'd start with El Salvador. El Salvador, about 28 years ago, finished a really nasty civil war in which both sides recruited child soldiers, often forced recruitment, stripping families apart, leaving an incredibly traumatized communities on both sides of that war. But social workers who had the trust and confidence in communities set up safe spaces for people to talk.
It seems that we have briefly lost Rory, but I hope he will be able to join us. So if we just allow a minute or two, this is the joy of live online seminars. So just to use this opportunity, in terms of seeing each other, I'm not sure whether the type of Zoom we're using will allow for everyone to be visible. Ah, Rory's back.
I'm back, sorry.
Wonderful.
Was it just me that left, or?
Very temporarily, please feel free to continue.
Well, hopefully it won't happen again. So back in El Salvador, they were able to bring divided communities together. And at a particular point in the ceasefire process, those communities came onto the streets themselves and demanded of their politicians on both sides for peace. And so the social workers actually played an important historical role in civil society demanding peace. And that helped build the peace process. It's a really key piece of evidence on the importance of social facilitation by professionals, by social workers, bringing people together with a new vision for the lives that they want in a prolonged war situation. We saw some of that also in Northern Ireland, that social workers were bringing divided communities together right from the 1970s. And in interviews with those community members now, they talk about the importance of that process in building understanding between divided communities. In a post-war situation, Rwanda has done some incredible work, or a post-genocide situation, I apologize for that mistake. Social workers advanced after the genocide came to a stop and a new government was in place. Social workers advanced a traditional indigenous model of practice to help build peace across communities that lived in the same villages, side by side, but had one group had committed a genocide against the other. And in that situation, social workers advanced an ancient tribal system where the chief would issue a cow to every family. And what that did is it gave everyone equal status as they had to rebuild their society. It gave everyone the status of having a cow which fertilizes the fields, which provides milk, which breeds other cows. And what was also important to that strategy is that forevermore, and it continues to this day, that the first calf will be swapped with your neighbor, and to build those relationships, to build that reconciliation. And it was a very, very successful strategy. There are many, many other examples. Social workers in Yemen, so we're going to another part of the world now, who the UN describes Yemen as being the most horrific humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Social workers in Yemen started off by recognizing that the schools are bombed, the roads are bombed, the people live in terror every night, and they needed to provide some support for children, some activities for children. But as they did that, and children came and did workshops together to talk about their experience of trauma and to do play and to do theatre and to do sports, the parents never left. The parents never left the children. They wanted to get involved. And it grew and it grew and it grew into regular sessions with communities coming together, How can we support each other? How can we survive this ongoing war? And when you speak to the community members now, they say, this process gives us hope. This process saves us from absolute total despair. And of course, the last example I just want to give, which is a very, very current one, is that the role social workers are playing in Ukraine and on the border countries, working together, mobilizing resources, supporting people fleeing for their lives in the most respectful and dignified way. And it reminds me of what I'm seeing here in Ukraine, with the Ukraine situation now, of what a refugee said to me when I met him in Uganda once. He said, I walked 4 countries to escape a war. And the first person, in the 4 years it took me to get to where I am now, the first person that recognized I was human was a social worker, who recognized my dignity was a social worker, from going from refugee to refugee camp. So these are all powerful examples. The role of social work in facilitating communities support each other to come together is a key strategy that is often overlooked by the United Nations and key geopolitical processes that see peace negotiations at the authority to the authority level with mediation. But they neglect the importance of on-the-ground support for the people affected by war and helping them to have their action, their say, and to create a new vision together for the world that they need, for a world that is better than the one that they're having and the one that led to war. So this is why this series is so important. I hope it shines light on the absolutely significant role that we have as social workers in peace building. I hope it shines light. I hope it helps build policy. I hope it helps build understanding and reduces the terrible, terrible situation of social workers working in isolation in war zones. And I just finished just by saying, one of the toughest parts of my job is talking to social workers that are being bombed. It happens, it's happening now in the Ukraine. How do you end the conversation? Are they going to survive the next day? Speaking to social workers in Gaza, and the last time that they were under a perpetual bombing, that bombing started at midnight, and they would reach out on Facebook chat and say, hey, I just want to let you know I'm here. My family is sitting with me. And it was just that they wanted to let someone know. And so we need to build systems around people who are in these extraordinary, challenging and horrific and horrible situations. So thank you to the organisers for this.
Great, thank you, Rory. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation, and a presentation that included important examples. Although we have allowed space, and we will make sure that there will be time towards the end of the session for discussion, I'm wondering if there is any urgent type of questions or clarifications that people may need.
There is one from the chat from Omar Mohammed. Hi, Omar, who asks, Rory, are these examples of social workers working with people with lived experience of political conflict to advocate for peace documented in any way? This is really important and interesting to learn about, and I'd like to explore these examples further.
So my connection's not too good today. I think, is it documented? Is that the key question?
You can, right. Yeah. So everything.
So we're beginning, yeah. Omar, we're beginning to document. You're all frozen.
we can hear you. We can hear you.
Right. I'm sorry, my connection's very bad. So okay. Omar, we're beginning to document and tell these stories, and I think Ria and Vasilios can point you to some of the recent publications where some of these things are documented. And we're trying to build as much research as we can. And I just want to say that it's not just that we need research, we need these discussions, we need to share this information. That's a part of the research process, of course, but there is a lot of action happening, and how do we capture that action, and how do we translate that into learning? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rory. And I also would like to confirm that after each and every session, we will uploading materials from the presentation in lieu of really documenting the discussions, but also speakers will be including recommended bibliography and available articles. So by the end of this 6-week course, we should be able to build an important repository of relevant resources. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our next presenter for today. Our next presenter is Dr. Ricardo Chaparro-Pacheco, who's an assistant professor of social work and director of the social work degree program at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in the US. Ricardo, welcome.
Thank you, Vasilios, and thank you to the International Federation of Social Workers for opening this great opportunity that I would fully agree with Rory, the importance of documenting, but especially of sharing this information and making the contributions of social work visible. I see that, like everywhere, how many people benefit from the work of social workers in many different registries, particularly in relation to armed conflicts and war, and not that many people know that social workers are involved. So yeah, it is quite important to document and to disseminate this information and to learn from here. All right, I already spent 40 seconds and counting of the limited time that I have. I'm going to talk about social work in the scenario of prolonged armed conflict in Colombia. So I will spend a while explaining what is this prolonged armed conflict scenario in Colombia. And from there, I want to illuminate, I want to set the foundations to say, or to refer how this scenario of armed conflict has informed social work training, social work practice, and social work research in Colombia. These 3 scenarios of social work practice, if you will, training, practice, and research. So Colombia, in case that no one knows, or you haven't watched Encanto by Disney yet, Colombia is in South America. The tip of the north of South America connects South America with Panama. And our armed conflict amounts way back to 80 years. This actually started, you could say, like since our very independence from Spain in 1810, but several political struggles have continued, and nowadays we count, or we refer that our armed conflict goes back to 80 or probably 60 years ago. What has prolonged this conflict? Well, it first started as the opposition of political ideologies, the traditional confrontation between liberal and conservative ideologies. But over time, this conflict has gone through a series of changes, transformations, and stages. At first, Colombia is a rather rural country, and the first confrontations focus, as I said, in models for the power, for holding power between liberal and conservative ideologies, but also on the ownership of land, means of production. Yet, as the conflict evolved and deteriorated, the ownership of land moved or transitioned into a conflict of who domains the territory, who has control over the territory. And as I said, this has led to several changes or transitions. Starting in the 1950s, in spite of this political confrontation from before, but
we seem to have a few connection issues and connectivity issues, but hopefully Ricardo is going to join us. There have been a few questions about joining. It seems that a few people have difficulty hearing the speakers. I have now asked for to kind of see what advice to provide, because apparently you can hear us and we are all on the same platform, so I'm not sure what the issue is. We'll try and find out and come back to if there is particular technical advice. But it seems that the rest of, based on the questions and participation comments, it seems that the rest of the people can hear okay. Rory, while we wait for Ricardo to come back, is it okay to just alert you? There is this a comment and a question from Ayola Stephen Adebayo in Q&A. To the speaker, thanks. Well, is there a proper network for social workers around the globe to connect, like a social platform, especially with Ukraine? Hearing a social worker view from that end, I believe it would be great, and maybe build a process further in the profession to help. Thanks.
So at the moment, that's a very good question, and there are informal networks and there are more formal networks. So the formal networks are through IFSW, through your national association, and through your national association, you can connect and link with social workers across the world. There are, and I'm a part of some of them, networks that people have put together spontaneously in Facebook chat groups and in other social media platforms of people reaching out to each other to discuss those things. Feel free to write on any of the social media forums. I'm a social worker wanting to link with other social workers in conflict situations. And please try also to connect them to IFSW, because the more we can build those networks of understanding, the stronger we'll all be. Thanks.
Thank you, Rory. And Ricardo is back. These things do happen, so welcome back, Ricardo.
Hello, my most sincere apologies. Of all days when you don't want to have trouble with the internet, they reset the network in your office, right? Anyway. So can you listen to me clearly, and can you look at me clearly? Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll try to go back. I am talking about like the context of armed conflict, and I was in Colombia, and I was referring to the 1950s when the confrontation between liberal and conservatives, actually these two factions achieved a sort of agreement to alternate power, and from there came a criminalization of the difference, meaning whatever third possibility, and mostly socialist or communist, whatever smell or whatever was accused of being communist or socialist was strongly criminalized and persecuted. And this unfortunately counted with the support of foreign governments, particularly the United States. Something else that prolonged this armed conflict in this period of 80 years, divisions within the same rebel forces that went against the government. At first, you could count probably one, no more than two rebel forces against the government, but at some point in the 80s, you could count up to 25 different guerrilla groups. And on top of that, later came the influence of drug trafficking, which unfortunately marked strongly Colombia. And this also led to the emergence of paramilitary groups, meaning groups of civilians that were supporters of the government. And at first, you could say that there were some paramilitary groups that entered into the confrontation in order to protect from the attacks of rebels, because rebels not only attacked government facilities, but also civilians. But with the entrance of drug trafficking, the conflict deteriorated very much, and both factions, rebels and paramilitaries, started to profit from this drug trafficking. And on top of that, the situation went out of control for the government, and the Colombian government also became a perpetrator of human rights abuses, trying to hold control of the situation that since long ago had escaped from their hands. And this all happens in between the 1950s and even the 80s and 90s. And during all this time, we had an experience of about 15 and plus peace negotiations. I wouldn't say peace accords, but rather peace negotiations with each individual rebel group or paramilitary group. But the consequences of these peace negotiations had been rather of atomization and newer expressions of the armed conflict, because not every member from the armed group joins the peace negotiation, and from there they start to open their new rebel group. I was talking to a colleague from Argentina. He works for the International Monetary Fund, and he was actually happy that the FARC, the older of the guerrillas in Colombia and apparently in the world, had come to an end in 2016 with a peace negotiation with them, when the reality is that now we are facing the dissidences of the FARC, and that is actually their name, FARC dissidents. So again, these peace agreements, rather than to periods of peace, have led to newer expressions of armed confrontation and violence. What have been those main expressions? I'm just going to quickly summarize them. Mainly, and probably the most scary of all, murder. And I'm talking about selective murders, but also massacres. The killing of people between 4 to 5 people up to the hundreds in several episodes, in one single event of killing 80 or even 100 people. Because massacres, and particularly for the paramilitary forces, became a means to establish regional control, to establish presence, and to say, we are here and we are the ones that control the territory. Along with massacres and along with these, with the perpetration of these murders in mass, there are many expressions of sexual violence, and particularly against women and different sexual expressions. The most visible consequence of these massacres has been internal displacement. And from there, we have families that have been displaced as a single unit, as a single family, or entire communities and villages that have left their places of origin to come into the cities. For several years, Colombia has been at the top place of internal displacement, according to many statistical databases, including the Red Cross. And another effect from this perpetration of violence, confinement. And this one is harder to account for. By confinement, I mean how armed groups place some boundaries and do not allow the interaction with a particular community. And that leads, of course, to the escalation of violence, to more selective murders, and all these types of violence. Other expression of this violence, kidnapping. The kidnapping for purposes of ransom or for purposes of putting some pressure in changing political decisions. Torture. And this particular form of violence has been perpetrated by the armed forces and the governmental forces. Torture and forced disappearance, particularly of community leaders. And parallel to this form of violence, we also find forced recruitment of children. The Colombian army stopped recruiting children up to 1996, 1997, following some pressure from the international community, but illegal armed forces continued recruiting minors, recruiting children, and we are currently coming to learn that children from indigenous ethnicities, children from indigenous peoples in Colombia are committing suicide to prevent being recruited. And that is like happening right now. With all of this, it is hard to say, but life goes on. I mean, this has been a conflict for about 80 years. And unfortunately, the Colombian people has had to learn with this violence happening mostly in the rural areas in the country, and sometimes just touching the urban cities. But all of this, I borrow the concept of socio-political violence by Ignacio Martín Baró, a scholar from El Salvador, to suggest that what started as a political violence, or excuse me, a confrontation between political factions, deteriorated into socio-political violence, where Colombians have integrated this expression of violence into their everyday. And in that way, violence is not like the last resort to solve conflicts, but rather became the first resource to solve our conflicts and to solve not only political differences, but pretty much any type of difference. And also violence became a means for living. People thinking of becoming a paramilitary or thinking of joining guerrilla groups in order to earn some living. And this has had several consequences. On the one hand, the militarization of our everyday. On the other hand, the desensitization of other violences, meaning Colombians stop looking at the seriousness and cruelty of other types of violence like domestic abuse or bullying or any other type of everyday violence if it doesn't include blood or kidnapping or any other of the hard expressions of the armed conflict. And social workers in Colombia have been there to help people to cope with this violence every day, and particularly to assist the victims. I have very short time, so I will try to summarize the following points. On the one hand, how this scenario of prolonged armed conflict has shaped training in social work. Training in social work in Colombia has been highly founded upon a structural approach. Even our clinical practice is connected to some understandings of political struggles, of critiques against consumerist capitalism, but also critiques against totalitarian regimes and any sort of totalitarian ideas. And also a strengths-based approach has become a very strong approach in the training of social workers in Colombia, because this connects with the practice of social work. We have learned to privilege the resources of resiliency and of agency, so people advocate for themselves. So victims learn to advocate by themselves. So let me move into how the armed conflict has shaped social work practice in Colombia. On the one hand, of course, the provision of first-hand humanitarian assistance in situ to those who are confined or those who have been victims of these expressions of violence, addressing basic needs, but also providing some clinical assistance to prevent the emergence of trauma. That is like the immediate presence of social workers. Yet, the biggest expression of social work, I will find it in the macro level. On the one hand, accompanying and supporting communities that have been, rural communities that have been affected by violence, supporting rural communities that have been displaced, and providing them through popular education with resources so they can have a structural understanding of what led them out of their lands, out of their farms, and in that way they can learn to advocate by themselves for truth of what happened, for justice, measures of justice and correction, for measures of reparation, and for measures of not repetition. Social workers have been present there, empowering people with tools for them to advocate by themselves on these aspects that I just mentioned: truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. And that has also, the cause of this has involved the lives of several colleagues, several social work colleagues. And starting in 2005, the recent peace negotiation with paramilitary forces made clear the presence of child soldiers. So social workers have been there also assisting the needs of these child soldiers. But I should mention that child soldiers, to some extent, enjoy of a dual condition of victims, of perpetrators, but also victims. And I would like to point out that social workers, both in Colombia, but I have seen that in some other spaces, to some extent feel comfortable navigating this duality of the victim perpetrator, the child perpetrator. But a bigger ethical conflict comes when we have to assist former soldiers, adult perpetrators. So social workers have been then like assisting these former adult perpetrators with their efforts for social reintegration, but research has not advanced that much in working with this population. And with that, allow me to quickly jump into how armed conflict has shaped social work research. Social work research has been mostly focused on the psychosocial effects of violence, and particularly the psychosocial effects of internal displacement, making a particular emphasis on how women and children have been affected as the most vulnerable populations. Social work research has also made important contributions to understand in Colombia the origins and the psychosocial effects of forced recruitment of child soldiers. And once again, I highlight this duality between victim and perpetrator. Social workers have also made a valuable contribution in the recovery of truth, in truth-seeking mechanisms like historical memory, the lived experience of victims going through all this violence. And just now, we are starting to consider ways of researching about the psychosocial effects on adult combatants. And once again, I insist on this duality or this ethical question about to what extent we should work with adult perpetrators, because we have this question: to what extent we want to empower these adult perpetrators, or to what extent we do not want to. Of course, we want to prevent adult perpetrators to go back to the armed group, but at the same time, to what extent we want to excuse their responsibility. And that has been the emphasis of this line of research with perpetrators: responsibility. How former adult perpetrators in the armed conflict have elaborated any sense of responsibility for the atrocities that they perpetrated in the past. In conclusion, in 30 seconds, as you can see, the armed conflict has influenced every sphere of life in Colombia. And that's how I suggest in Colombia we can speak of a transition from political violence into socio-political violence. And social workers walking in the everyday with the people, the victims, and also the perpetrators are working in our training, in our practice, and in our research to empower with tools and to privilege the agency and the dignity of human people to overcome the challenges that the armed conflict has posed. Thank you so much for your attention, and my apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much. Thank you. There are very brief glitch in the road, and we have two questions which you can also, I think, Ricardo, see if it's easier for you to see it in the Q&A. So the first one comes from Ekwa Gaisi. What has been the effort of international community to put the lasting solution for a conflict of 80 years? Look like there is no ending to this.
In all honesty, yeah, there is no short way to say there is an answer. Yes, I'm not going to lie, there has been a huge support from the international community. I should particularly recognize the collaboration from the European community and also from North America in providing resources and empowering social work, research, and practice to empower communities. One of the biggest contributions that I forgot to mention in this empowerment of communities and with this strengths-based approach, Colombian social workers have trained local psychosocial supporters, which helps a lot in addressing the first psychosocial and psychological effects from violent events, and even reduces significantly, substantially, the amount of people who may need further specialized assistance. So the international community has cooperated a lot in providing humanitarian assistance and supporting the claims for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. But in terms of coming to a specific end to this complicated situation of the armed conflict, I don't see it like coming in the short term. It still requires effort, changing the militarized culture. And I do see a new generation coming up with this new mentality that violence is not the response. Yet something happens on the road and we resort back to the use of violence.
Let's keep the other question for the end.
Yes,
I think so, and also invite people to start preparing the questions, because there will be about 15 minutes towards the end to have a concluding discussion.
Wonderful. Without further ado, I'm going to invite May. Hopefully she's able to join. Thank you so much, Ricardo, again. And I will hand over to May Nasrawy, who is going to be talking about her study into lived experiences of well-being among young Palestinian and Arab Jerusalemites, which she conducted as part of her PhD. Over to you, May.
Muted, sorry. Thank you, Ray, and thanks for the panel for inviting me to share my research findings. I've got a bit more structured presentation, so I've got slides. I hope that's all right. I will keep the time. Okay, so let me just share my. Oh, I'm not able to share my screen for some reason, but that's fine. I can still go through the presentation.
If you put it in the chat, I'll do it on your behalf.
You can go ahead and share.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to now, May?
I'll try. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay.
Maybe if you make me a co-host or something.
Yeah, that would be the best. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sorted now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. My presentation today is based on my doctoral research, which was completed in October last year. My study explored the well-being of young people from Arab Palestinian minority communities in Jerusalem through understanding their everyday lived experiences. My main objective was to create new understandings of young people's well-being in contexts affected by political conflict. Arab Palestinian Jerusalemites are a diverse group experiencing marginalization and discrimination in policies and provision of services, which negatively impacts or affects their well-being in various aspects of their lives, including the social and the economic and the political. Through my study, I was able to develop an in-depth insight into children and young people's everyday lived experiences and provide new understandings of well-being which go beyond the psychological impact of exposure to political conflict and the development of PTSD. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few slides. This meant I was able to move away from traditional and predominant medicalized perspectives of well-being to include a psychosocial perspective on young people's everyday lived experiences of enduring suffering, oppression, and inequality in the context of Jerusalem and the prolonged Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was also able to explore the potential of role of extracurricular art activities in promoting young people's well-being in the context of Jerusalem. And before I go into more details about my research and key findings from my study, I think it is important for me to first introduce some key concepts and highlight some common and predominant perspectives and understandings around how children and young people experience political conflict and violence and how they make sense of it in their everyday lives. Defining political conflict for someone who was born into and grew in conflict was, as you can imagine, not as easy as I thought it would be. And unpacking this concept involved an exploration of events that have significantly shaped my perception of life and to a certain extent who I was. By turning to the literature, I was struck by the many different definitions I found in different sources of knowledge. And I came across, obviously, WHO's definition, which I used in my study, and I include today to highlight some thoughts. And the definition looks at political conflict as a situation in which violence is deliberately used to achieve political gains, resulting in physical, mental, and material loss, as well as negative consequences on those affected by it. And this definition obviously was important to me because it points out that violence, and I argue in all of its forms, is deliberately used in political conflicts to achieve certain political, social, and economic gains. However, kind of looking deeper, it was clear to me that this definition and all of the other definitions I came across was generally not really not included children and young people in their definitions, and also did not include any reference to the impact of political conflict on their lives, and they were more focused on goals and gains rather than impact. Not moving, okay. And just going back to the impact of political conflict on children and young people, which I'm really interested in. We know from previous research that children and young people living in these contexts around the world continue to suffer physical, mental, and emotional consequences of growing up in these hostile and unstable, violent environments. We also know that political conflict has the potential to cause trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly when those involved, exposed to it include children and young people. It can also cause physical destruction of infrastructure, physical injury, loss of life, displacement, mental and emotional consequences. But what we really don't know is how children and young people experience it in different contexts, and the meanings they attach to their experiences and how these experiences impact their well-being. Particularly if we're talking about a prolonged conflict, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is likely to cause a long-lasting impact on children and young people's lives. It's because the different forms of violence become the norm over time, and something that those exposed to experience in every aspect of their lives, something children and young people are just born into. And what I also felt was missing, obviously from research and studies, was what it means to actually talk to children and young people in living in these circumstances, and to understand from their own perspective what it means for them to grow up in these complex realities. Rather than doing research on children and young people, I knew that we needed to do research with children and young people, allowing them to talk about what matters to them, regardless of any imagined agendas. I knew that I wanted accounts that could help professionals gain a better understanding of the local and international experiences of young people in living in contexts affected by political conflict, and how they might respond to their needs in ways that could help create meaning in their lives. And this is where my study came in. It allowed me to highlight children and young people's experiences of war from their own perspective, and to shed light on what really matters to them in these contexts, which are characterized by violence and prolonged conflict. And my study came after years of frustration, both as a social worker and as someone who grew up in conflict. And this frustration was basically based on the experiences of working with children and young people in these contexts, and realizing that despite the great work that we were doing and the interventions we carried out to support children and young people's well-being, it constantly felt that we were failing them time after time. And I realized this mostly when I saw the growing hopelessness that children and young people felt and experienced. And this led me to, or put me on a path to search for what it is that we're missing, and what we can do to better support children and young people living in these contexts, particularly when we talk about prolonged political conflict. And I'll move to give a brief introduction in my research. So the voices of children and young people living in Jerusalem from the Arab Palestinian minority is largely missing from research studies being conducted on them, specifically when we talk about assessing their well-being. Research to date on well-being in this region in general has been very much influenced by the Western perspective and understanding of mental health and well-being. And this understanding looks at the linear relationship between exposure to political conflict and the development of psychological symptoms, most commonly PTSD. For such an approach, these studies mostly use positivist methodologies. While these have brought us important findings, as we know from previous studies and wars, that conflict can cause trauma. However, we also know that trauma isn't and cannot be a universal term. It is both understood and experienced differently in different cultures. And therefore, in order to understand the impact of exposure to political conflict and growing up in such complex realities, it is important to understand the context and the culture and how people relate to others and to their environment. Through my study, I hope to create new understandings of young people's experiences, which go beyond discourses of trauma, into shedding light on their everyday challenges and struggles they face living in these contexts. And as a practitioner, I also wanted to find new ways in which we can better support the well-being of young people. And what my research argued is that the link between political conflict and well-being of young people is not linear, but contextual and subjective. And that the impact of political conflict on everyday lives of young people is not universal. The lived experiences of young people exposed to conflict cannot be reduced to PTSD and psychological symptoms, cannot only. And that our understanding of well-being determines our approach to support it. And this is also determined by the methodologies that we use in research. There are different ways of understanding well-being. My argument in my study is that well-being is relational. It is about how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to our environment. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, we'll get there. Yeah, that's on. So these are sort of common themes and findings from my study. And young people's stories conveyed an important message about their well-being, and that the major challenges they face to well-being are structural, shaped by multiple layers of power within the overall social and political context and structure. Violence was a very powerful theme, which constantly emerged from young people's stories, and it seemed to be embedded in their everyday lives and spaces they occupied. Young people also talked about not feeling safe in their communities and experiencing different sources of violence, including verbal, psychological, and physical. Some of the examples which emerged included gender inequality, religious and racial discrimination, and bullying at school. Young people also talked about not being able to express their thoughts and emotions across the different spaces in their lives, so at school, home, and in their community. And they constantly felt unheard, which made them feel that they lacked control over their lives and that what they said didn't matter. A further sort of in-depth interpretation of my findings kind of led me to find out or understand that young people also experienced a different type of inequality within their lives, and they experienced a duality that what really supports them also oppressed them at the same time, and this was apparent in almost all aspects of their lives, including at school, at home, and in their communities. Doing that time. And it was clear from the findings of my study that young people's perceptions of their needs and professionals' perceptions of young people's needs were kind of two different things and clearly not heading in the same direction. And I guess the important question for us to, as social workers and practitioners working with children and young people, is how we can promote young people and promote young people's well-being in context of prolonged political conflict. And I think the most important thing that I drew from my study is the importance of actually listening to young people and promoting agency and real participation, and obviously addressing other needs as well. So things like structural violence and other types of violence within these communities. But also, and most importantly, challenging dominant perceptions of well-being and understandings of well-being, which don't really include experiences of young people in different contexts and what really matters to them. And I think that really has implications on the ways that we design interventions and support for young people in these contexts. And I'll just kind of leave you with that. I hope I'm good with timing, but I just wanted to sort of highlight how sort of these experiences of inequality and discrimination that young people were experiencing and still are important to kind of highlight, not just within research, but also within practice. And I think we need more research that is able to capture their everyday lived experiences and how they experience living in these contexts and in these complex realities. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, can we stop sharing the PowerPoint? Yeah, great. Now we can see. Thank you so much. What an interesting and relevant and timely presentation. We still have about 15 minutes, and we had planned this for 4 questions to all participants and all speakers. I think there are already a few questions floating in the chat box. If there are more questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section, and Ria and I will read them out. I think there is a question for Ricardo. Ricardo, you mentioned social work intervention with child soldiers. So Fiza Sagir is asking whether you would like to say a few things about the key interventions social workers engage with vis-a-vis child soldiers.
Sure, thank you. Well, the main intervention is, of course, the closest of our resources, and that is education. It is educating children, and not that many children, because, of course, we can imagine, and I think that from May's presentation, we can see how young people who experience armed conflict mature faster, right? So many times you may be talking to minors, and yet the level of maturity and understanding many times, more often than not, is above our own as professionals. So the main resource that has been used is education, educating children on trying to disarm the culture and trying to attempt to demilitarize the everyday, education in different ways of solving conflicts, and educating minors as much as possible on these historical, contextual, structural conditions of violence. So from a very early age, they may have like an understanding of what they were used for, how they were abused in the middle of this conflict, but also what may be the possibilities for a future for them. I'm going to quickly share an anecdote, and it is that back in 2005, 2004, when the first children were visibly demobilized, because of course there have been demobilized children for a long time, but in 2005 2004 it was made public. The Institute for Child Welfare in Colombia, the Child Welfare Authority in Colombia, in their policy guidelines, they highlighted that the purpose of the intervention was to return children, child soldiers, to the world of children. But allow me to highlight how unrealistic that is, because you cannot think of a world of children, or whatever definition you have of a world of children, for someone who has gone through experiences of actually killing, of opening and dismembering bodies, of kidnapping, even children who have raped and been raped as part of their experience in the armed conflict. So it is like trying to come up with a grounded sense of understanding of the armed conflict, how they were abused in the middle of this conflict, and from there also from the strengths-based approach, trying to figure out what are those capabilities that they come with equipped after their experience in the armed conflict. We are talking about children who were very agile, and therefore they were great messengers. We are talking about children, and particularly girls and young women, who were trained in nursing skills, in paramedic skills. So how we can open a space for them to continue their medical training. And things of the sort have strongly influenced this work with former child soldiers.
Thank you, Ricardo. Before we move into the next question, I think Ria, the most commonly asked question is, where can we find more information about these research and more resources? Can I repeat that after this session, we will contact presenters, ask them for the resources, the research, recommended bibliography, and then we will upload all this material on the IFSW Education Commission website. So this is the intention. So within a period of 6 weeks, we will eventually create a large and extensive repository of relevant work that is missing. And this is what we can see from the questions.
And also be mindful particularly for May's work, and I'm very happy to see all the reactions to May's work and to everybody else's. But I have a slight investment as May's supervisor. This is work yet to be fully published as well. So some of the links are yet to come, but we will keep you updated as we progress.
Right, more questions.
Do you want to continue?
Yeah, there was a question for May, which I thought it was interesting, and and a bit of an unorthodox question. You know, when we present our research, very much we focus on these generic views and what we call data, right, in research jargon. So somebody here has asked, can you please tell us an inspiring story from a child you've met in Jerusalem, a story around the well-being and the pressures they faced? I will have to say, not a very extensive story because we don't have the time, but an anecdote like Ricardo mentioned before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always difficult to know what to include in presentations of 10 minutes. So sorry if I didn't include enough. Yeah, I think one thing I can think of is one of the children I interviewed, and we were together in a focus group as well, came to me after one of the interviews and said, how she felt really great about speaking to somebody and being able to express her fears and talk about things without being judged, without fearing. You know, it's always when you're living in a conflict, it's always that feeling that you can't really talk about things, that things are taboo, we don't discuss it, we don't talk about it at school, and yet it's there with the young people, with the children, but they don't get opportunities to talk about them. And I guess I felt like really great to just be that person to give them that opportunity. But I think, you know, that's one in a million. Obviously this has, you know, this has to be addressed on various different levels. But I guess another potentially story from I guess a young boy who I think was 13 or 14 then, and I guess we were talking about what well-being means to him, and how you know, what makes him feel good, what makes him feel a little bit low, and he started talking about how he liked drawing, but he couldn't do that at school and couldn't find anywhere where he can learn how to draw, or even somebody who can kind of you know, just show him how to use colors. But he still would draw something, not knowing what he's doing, and felt really good about it, and said that, you know, most of the time people think that it's other things that make you feel better, but you know, those little things that really enjoy as children, and I guess you know, that probably made me want to cry rather than anything else, but yeah.
Thank you so much. There was a question which was asked of all of the presenters, and it's probably going to be the final one because it's for all three of you. And Waka Amin asks, my question is for all the presenters, what do you have to say about the role of social work in case when he or she or they is one of the victims of violence? So Rory, do you want to open with your answer?
So the question is, what is our commentary when social workers are victims of violence?
Yes.
So I think Ricardo's already recognised that social workers do die in conflict situations, and we experience this in all conflict situations. It's an enormous tragedy. What's really important is that we build systems to support social workers in countries where they are in danger. They are so key, as we've heard from Ricardo and we've heard from May, in helping families and communities to support each other, to contain each other, and to also build a new vision for the world. And without social workers, very often this doesn't happen. So it's so important that we find ways to support social workers, to stop them feeling isolation, to stop them putting themselves in excessive danger. And that comes about through reaching out to social workers. And anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. If you've got a friend on your social media that's a social worker in a war zone, hey, I'm here to support you in any way I can. Now, if you don't get a response, that's because they're just working flat out, but they will really deeply appreciate your reaching out. It'll make a big difference to them. I just want to make one tiny comment. The founders of the profession of social work said that the absence of war does not equal peace. It's social justice that enables peace to be sustained. And so that's the role of social workers. We're not just working to stop military violence. We're working to build resourceful communities that respect difference, that want everybody to thrive. And that's one of the most key important elements of why social workers are needed in these situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ricardo, do you have anything that you would like to add to this really comprehensive and inspiring answer?
What can you add to such a powerful response? I do have like a couple of things to add. I would reward everything that Rory has presented in terms of networking. Networking is quite powerful. And nowadays we have these powerful social media platforms for networking and the importance of mutual support. One of the questions in the chat, not in the Q&A section, but in the chat was about if social workers in Colombia gather to share their experiences about armed conflict. The short answer is yes, yet they are not formal encounters. They are mostly informal encounters, informal gatherings to share the burnout, to share the secondary trauma, or to share the compassion fatigue as well. So yes, there is some networking, and that is a key element in the prevention of burnout and self-care, which is nowadays like so preached. But the two more things that I would add to Rory's intervention, or to Rory's response, and this comes from my experience in Colombia. The second word that I would add is documentation. Social workers become primary documenters and primary repositories of the information about the human rights abuses committed both against communities and also against us as professionals, as professional practitioners. So documentation becomes key here, and documentation also becomes key in the dynamics of networking. And the third element, or the third word that I would add, is empowerment, because chances are, and we have had experiences in Colombia where the communities that we work with have achieved such a level of empowerment that they protect us. They may not be the professionals, they may actually be the targets of violence, and yet many times they are the ones providing protection to the social workers or the humanitarian workers and missionaries that are working among them. So this importance of empowerment, acknowledging the agency of the victims. They are not there just to receive our support, but they are active agents in their own protection, and protecting us as supporters is key in these circumstances, I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. May, do you have anything to add as concluding thoughts as we approach our conclusion for this first seminar?
I think I would emphasize what Ricardo said about empowerment as well. I think it's really important. And I think one message I'd like to leave is also that understanding what Rory said, understanding difference is really important. And even when we think about different concepts, when we think about research, it's and when we think about people living in conflict, we have to remember that it's different contexts and people have different needs. And we as adults, for example, thinking about children as well, it's all different perceptions, and we have to, I think, remember that in our work as social workers as well, not to make assumptions about people's needs as well.
Thank you all so much. I think this demonstrates very clearly the power of us coming as a community together to explore our joint and shared experiences, which affect so many across the globe, across a range of conflicts at this point in time. I wish to thank all our presenters. I also want to, extend a particular thanks to Bernard Mayaka from IFSW, who so kindly set up the Zoom and supported all of our work through all the glitches and navigating all our problems. So Bernard, thank you so much. He's the invisible force behind all this work. I also have took the liberty to post a link to a survey. If you could tell us about what worked for you really well and what you'd like us to improve, we will keep that in mind going forward. Thank you all so much. All the resources we can share at this point are going to be shared via our website. I also want to remind you that the next seminar is going to be, the remaining ones are going to be on Tuesday. So the next one is going to be on the 5th of April, and the topic is working with refugees and displaced populations. I really hope you'll be able to join us in as high a number as this. And thank you all so much. And thank you once again to our wonderful presenters, to May, to Rory, and to Ricardo. Thank you all so much. And I hope everybody enjoys their morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.